What if the person who's supposed to protect the law gets arrested by the very people they're supposed to be protecting us from? Rodney, the FBI Director, a man who stands at the helm of national security, was wrongfully detained by officers who abused their power at a crowded airport. This wasn't just another case of mistaken identity. This was a shocking breach of the law. It's a betrayal on multiple levels, one that has serious consequences for all involved. The officers responsible weren't just enforcing the law, they were breaking it. And when they realized the gravity of their mistake, they didn't just apologize. They begged for forgiveness and knelt in front of Rodney, the very man they had wrongly detained. What led to this disturbing turn of events, and what does it reveal about the justice system and the people sworn to protect it? This is more than just an arrest. This is a reckoning. Now, I know you're probably wondering, how did we get here? What happened between the FBI director and these officers? How could something like this happen? Especially when we're talking about someone who leads one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. In today's video, we'll break down the shocking video footage that captured the entire confrontation. We'll dive into witness accounts, revealing first-hand perspectives from those who saw the incident unfold. But that's not all. What happened after the arrest is even more startling. The police, realizing they had wrongfully targeted Rodney, didn't just apologize. No, they took it a step further. They knelt. They begged for his forgiveness in front of dozens of witnesses. What led them to this point? And how does this moment change the way we think about power, justice, and accountability? Stick around as we uncover the full story, because you won't want to miss these jaw-dropping details. If you're new here, I'm glad you've joined us today, because we're about to dive into a story that hits at the core of our justice system, the people we trust, and the very fabric of the law. On this channel, we explore breaking news, legal controversies, and the stories that shape our world in ways that most don't even see coming. If you care about the truth, if you want to stay informed about the issues that impact our daily lives, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on explosive stories like the one we're covering today. And if you find this video compelling, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. It all began on a chilly afternoon at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City, a major hub known for its bustling terminals and frequent international flights. FBI Director Rodney had just arrived, flying in from Washington, D.C., ready to board another crucial meeting that would determine the course of national security operations. The flight had been long, and he was tired, but there was no time to waste. He was expected to meet with top intelligence officials for a high-level briefing. Little did Rodney know, this routine arrival would turn into a confrontation that would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. As soon as he stepped off the plane, Rodney was stopped by a pair of uniformed officers stationed near the gate. They were part of a heightened security detail, nothing unusual for such a prominent figure, but their approach was more aggressive than expected. "It started innocuously enough, sir. Can we ask you a few questions?" one of the officers asked, his tone cold but professional. But as the questioning continued, the situation began to feel off. The officers, after a few brief exchanges, asked him to step aside for further questioning. Rodney, confused but cooperative, agreed, thinking it was a simple misunderstanding. He had been through airport security countless times before, but this felt different. The officers, after briefly checking his identification, seemed to hesitate for a moment before signaling for backup. Rodney, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, wasn't immediately aware of the tensions building around him. What he didn't know at the time was that this wasn't a random check. The officers had already decided he was a potential threat based on nothing more than his appearance. The situation, which seemed like an ordinary security protocol at first, was beginning to spiral out of control. What began as a routine check quickly escalated when one of the officers wrongly identified Rodney as a potential security risk. The officer, possibly under stress from an already tense day or fueled by subconscious racial profiling, made the assumption that Rodney was involved in something suspicious based solely on his appearance. The tall, composed man with a calm demeanor and an air of authority didn't fit the profile of a normal traveler in their eyes. The officers, however, did not pause to consider the possibility that they were dealing with one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Rodney had no idea what was going on. As an FBI director, he was used to scrutiny, to questions about his safety, and the ongoing protection of sensitive information. But he wasn't used to being treated like a criminal, questioned, and detained by people who had no idea who he really was. As the situation unfolded, the officers became more and more insistent, even demanding that he provide further documentation to prove his identity. "Sir, you're going to need to come with us," one officer said flatly, now holding his arm firmly. Rodney tried to explain, stating who he was and offering his credentials, but the officers weren't listening. They were caught up in their own assumptions and wouldn't believe him. At this point, Rodney started to feel the weight of the moment. He wasn't being treated as a colleague in law enforcement, he was just another man being judged based on his appearance and the assumptions of those around him. As the officers continued to question him, they became more hostile, surrounding him in what seemed like an attempt to intimidate him into submission. Rodney felt the chill of the situation seep into his bones, not from the weather, but from the growing realization that his safety was no longer a guarantee. He was a man who had spent his life fighting for justice, and now he was the one being unjustly treated. As the situation escalated, Rodney's frustration grew. He had tried to be patient, but now it was clear the officers had crossed a line. The officers were pulling him toward a small security room, away from the public eye, when Rodney was finally able to get a word in with one of the officers on the phone with their superiors. "I need to know who I'm talking to. I'm the FBI director. This is a mistake." The officer paused, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning recognition. He quickly relayed the information back to his colleagues, who were still grappling with their own disbelief. As they began to check the name more thoroughly, a few uncomfortable seconds passed. Rodney's identity, which should have been immediately clear, was now a shock to the officers who were holding him. When the realization hit them, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The smug confidence with which they had initially confronted him turned to embarrassment and shame. They quickly stepped back, now realizing their grave mistake. One officer, his face flushed with guilt, awkwardly stepped forward and muttered an apology. "Sir, we didn't know. We didn't realize." But the apology didn't stop there. To the shock of everyone watching, the officer and his colleagues took a knee before Rodney. It wasn't just a simple apology, it was a public act of contrition. They knelt before the very man they had just humiliated, begging for forgiveness in front of onlookers who were stunned by the turn of events. Rodney, standing tall amidst this apology, was left speechless. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension in the air, and the bitter irony of the situation. The officers who had been so certain in their actions now found themselves humbling themselves in a way that few would ever expect. This wasn't just an apology, it was a moment of reckoning. And while they had realized their mistake, the damage had already been done. In a shocking turn of events, the police, realizing their blunder, took an unprecedented step. They knelt and begged for forgiveness from FBI Director Rodney. What followed was a public display of humility that many felt was long overdue. But the sincerity of the officers' actions was immediately called into question. Were they genuinely remorseful for their actions, or was this simply an attempt to save face in the face of a public relations nightmare? It wasn't just any apology. The officers, realizing the gravity of their mistake, didn't offer a standard, scripted apology. Instead, they knelt in front of Rodney, an act that stunned everyone in the vicinity. Kneeling has often been associated with acts of submission or a plea for forgiveness, but seeing law enforcement officers sworn to uphold the law kneeling before a figure of authority was almost surreal. The officer who had first confronted Rodney was the first to speak. His voice wavered with embarrassment as he addressed the FBI Director. "Sir, we sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. We failed in our duties and deeply regret what happened here today." His words, though sincere, carried a hint of discomfort, as if he understood the weight of his actions. The officer's colleagues stood by, their faces a mix of guilt and shame. Rodney, a man who had spent years dealing with high-stakes situations, stood motionless, his face unreadable. While the officers kneeled, hoping their act would convey their remorse, it was clear that the damage had been done. Their actions were both a symbol of humility and a tacit admission of their failure. Some onlookers, already recording the scene, were equally moved by the sight of grown, armed officers brought to their knees. Others, however, saw this as an empty gesture, a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of their actions. The scene was awkward, to say the least. Despite the apology, there was an underlying tension in the air, as Rodney knew this wasn't just about the officers apologizing to him. It was a public acknowledgement that they had wrongly assumed his identity, leading to the violation of his personal rights and safety. Rodney, visibly affected, didn't immediately respond. His silence was as telling as any words could have been. The incident quickly went viral. As the footage of the kneeling officers made its way across social media platforms, reactions poured in from every corner of the internet. The hashtag FBA arrest went trending, sparking a national debate over police conduct, racial profiling, and the responsibility of law enforcement officers. On one side, many hailed the officers' public apology. "This is exactly the kind of humility we need in law enforcement," one Twitter user posted. "They made a mistake, owned up to it, and showed real accountability. More officers should be like this." Some saw the kneeling as a powerful moment of redemption, a step in the right direction for policing in America. However, the backlash was fierce. Critics of the officers' actions argued that the apology, while publicly grand, was far from sufficient. "Kneeling is not enough," one commenter wrote. "What's more important is that these officers need to be held accountable for their actions. They shouldn't get a pass just because they apologized publicly." Many felt that the police had only knelt to save face in front of the public, not because they genuinely cared about the harm they had caused. As the media ran with the story, talk shows, news channels, and online forums began to dissect every aspect of the incident. Some commentators noted that the apology was nothing more than an attempt to salvage public perception in light of the growing protests against police brutality. Others questioned how this could happen in the first place. How could law enforcement, trained professionals, make such a serious error? And why hadn't Rodney's identity been checked more carefully? The public's reaction mirrored the polarized state of the nation. People were split between applauding the apology and feeling that it was an empty gesture, offering no real solution to the root problem of racial profiling. As the story continued to develop, new angles of analysis emerged, with some questioning the systemic issues that led to such an incident. Beyond the public drama, the incident raised serious legal and institutional questions. What happens next for the officers involved in Rodney's wrongful detainment? Could this lead to legal consequences or internal investigations? And perhaps more importantly, could this event spark the beginning of much-needed policy changes in how law enforcement operates at airports and in public spaces? First and foremost, legal experts began weighing in on what the officers' actions could mean for them personally. Some believed that Rodney, as the FBI director, might file a civil suit for the violation of his rights, and given the public nature of the incident, it could become a landmark case. If Rodney chose to pursue legal action, the officers involved could face serious repercussions, including disciplinary measures, suspension, or even termination from their posts. This wasn't just a case of bad judgment, it was a violation of trust, and there were legal frameworks in place to hold the officers accountable. Internal investigations were likely already underway at the airport's law enforcement division. However, many questioned how effective such investigations could be, given the systemic issues that this incident highlighted. Would the officers receive a slap on the wrist, or would there be real consequences for the racial profiling that led to their actions? The institutional fallout was far-reaching as well. The incident raised questions about the adequacy of current training for law enforcement, particularly regarding racial bias and profiling. Calls for police reform grew louder. Would this be the catalyst that finally led to meaningful change in how officers are trained to handle situations involving minority groups? Or would this moment fade into the background, just another blemish on the long, painful history of law enforcement's relationship with race? One thing was clear: the incident had opened the door for a much larger conversation about police reform. It was a reminder of the long-standing issues of racial profiling, particularly in areas like airports where people of color have historically faced more scrutiny than their white counterparts. If there's one thing that became evident in the aftermath, it's that something needs to change within law enforcement. This story was just the latest, but not the last of its kind. In the coming weeks, legislators began discussing potential reforms to address these types of incidents, including improved vetting procedures at airports, mandatory anti-bias training for law enforcement officers, and stricter accountability measures for police who engage in racial profiling. The public's outcry for reform only intensified as the narrative surrounding the incident unfolded in the media. While this incident may have been a shocking and isolated event, it brings to light a much larger, deeply embedded issue: racial profiling in law enforcement. How many times have people of color been wrongfully targeted or detained simply based on their appearance? This arrest of FBI Director Rodney, a prominent and highly recognizable figure, highlights a painful truth. Racial profiling is a pervasive issue that reaches into every corner of society, from everyday citizens to the highest levels of government leadership. For decades, communities of color have been disproportionately affected by law enforcement's biases. From the 1991 beating of Rodney King by Los Angeles police officers to the more recent killings of black men, such as George Floyd, racial profiling has sparked outrage and widespread calls for justice and accountability. These incidents have led to questions about the legitimacy of policing practices and the systemic issues that allow such actions to occur. Studies and statistics show a disturbing trend. People of color are more likely to be stopped, questioned, and detained by law enforcement compared to their white counterparts. According to data from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, Black Americans are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white Americans, despite similar usage rates. Moreover, Black and Latino individuals are often subjected to more invasive searches, harsher treatment, and even physical violence, all based on prejudices that are often rooted in stereotypes. The FBI itself, an organization designed to uphold justice and enforce federal law, is not immune to these issues. The very fact that Rodney, the FBI director, was not immediately recognized and was subjected to a racial profiling incident reflects the gravity of the problem within law enforcement institutions across the nation. If the highest-ranking official in one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world can be wrongly targeted based on his appearance, then it is evident that the issue of racial profiling is far from isolated. The broader question that this incident raises is, how do we begin to change this? The answer is not simple, and it involves not just individual accountability, but systemic reform. It requires acknowledging that racial bias exists, both consciously and unconsciously, and taking proactive steps to address it through better training, improved procedures, and a cultural shift within law enforcement agencies. The FBI is one of the most powerful and influential institutions in the United States, tasked with protecting national security and upholding the rule of law. It is an organization that commands respect not just domestically but globally. However, this incident involving FBI Director Rodney And the wrongful actions of airport police raises important questions about the institution's image and authority. What does it mean when the head of the FBI, a symbol of law and order, can be mistaken for a criminal based on racial profiling? The impact of this incident on the FBI's leadership and public perception is profound. Rodney, a man who represents the integrity and professionalism of one of the world's most respected law enforcement agencies, was subjected to a humiliation that goes far beyond an individual's personal dignity. This public misstep undermines the perception of the FBI as an infallible, authoritative institution. If the FBI director himself, who is trained and recognized by colleagues worldwide, can be wrongfully detained by police officers at an airport, what does that say about the agency's ability to maintain control over its operations? This incident also poses a risk to national security. If the FBI cannot protect its own leadership from being wrongfully targeted based on racial bias, how can the agency protect the nation's secrets and ensure the safety of its citizens? The perception that even high-ranking officials are vulnerable to unjust treatment by law enforcement could erode public trust in the FBI's ability to safeguard the nation's interests, especially when it comes to sensitive operations or intelligence gathering. Moreover, this moment places additional pressure on Rodney as the leader of an organization already under scrutiny for its internal practices and its handling of sensitive cases. If he fails to address the racial profiling within the organization and within law enforcement as a whole, it could further diminish the FBI's credibility, both as a protector of national security and as a champion of justice. But how can Rodney move forward with his mission when the very agency he leads is entangled in the kind of misconduct he has spent his career trying to eliminate? Could this be the catalyst for significant police reform? Is this incident a wake-up call that the law enforcement community needs to address issues of racial bias and make meaningful changes to their training and practices? For years, activists, civil rights organizations, and communities of color have called for reform in policing, particularly in the wake of numerous high-profile incidents of racial profiling, excessive force, and unjust arrests. Yet meaningful change has often been slow, hindered by institutional resistance and a lack of political will. This incident, however, has the potential to shift the conversation in a new direction. The fact that an FBI director, an individual at the very top of the law enforcement hierarchy, was wrongfully detained is a powerful symbol of how deeply ingrained racial bias is within the system, and it could act as a turning point in the ongoing fight for police reform. There have already been calls from lawmakers, social justice groups, and concerned citizens for police departments to undergo more rigorous anti-bias training, especially regarding racial profiling. While this is an important first step, it's not enough. True reform would require more than just training. It would require comprehensive changes to policies and practices, from the way police officers are selected, trained, and deployed, to how their actions are monitored and held accountable. Legislators have already started discussing potential changes to how police departments function, including proposals for greater oversight, the use of body cameras in all encounters with the public, and the establishment of civilian review boards to oversee police misconduct. These reforms, if implemented, could address some of the root causes of racial profiling and police misconduct, but it would require the full support of law enforcement leaders and politicians alike. Moreover, this incident has sparked a larger conversation about the power and responsibility of law enforcement in society. Many are beginning to question whether the current system of policing is truly designed to protect and serve all citizens equally. Can we continue to justify the use of tactics that disproportionately harm marginalized communities? Should law enforcement be reimagined in a way that focuses more on community engagement and less on enforcement through intimidation? These are questions that need to be answered, and this incident could very well serve as the tipping point that forces these critical discussions into the spotlight. This story isn't just about one incident, it's about something much bigger. The question we all need to ask ourselves is, what do we want to see change in how law enforcement operates? What do we expect from those who are meant to protect us? What do you think about the police officers' actions in this case? Do you think their apology was genuine, or was it simply a reaction to the growing public backlash? Should we accept their kneeling as an honest acknowledgement of their mistake, or is it just a performative gesture designed to avoid deeper consequences? In light of the racial profiling issues this incident highlights, how do we prevent similar situations from happening again? Do you believe enough is being done to address these problems at the systemic level, or is this just another isolated event that will eventually fade away without lasting change? I want to hear your thoughts. How do you feel about the apology, the police's response, and what it means for the future of policing in America? Drop your opinions in the comments below, and let's start a real conversation about accountability, justice, and the steps we need to take to create a fairer system for everyone. The incident we saw unfold at John F. Kennedy International Airport was more than just an arrest, it was a wake-up call. It was a lesson in accountability, in recognizing our biases, and in understanding that even the most well-respected figures can fall victim to these deep-seated societal issues. The fact that the FBI Director Rodney, a man who represents justice and law enforcement at the highest level, could be so wrongfully detained is a testament to the work that still lies ahead. This incident also revealed the need for a change in how law enforcement interacts with the public, especially people of color. It raised important questions about how officers are trained, how biases are ingrained in their behavior, and what needs to be done to ensure that no one is subjected to racial profiling or unjust treatment. Whether this particular situation leads to the reform we desperately need remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. It's up to all of us to demand that change. If we want a future where incidents like this become rare rather than common, we have to be part of that solution. The question isn't just whether this event is an isolated mistake. It's whether we, as a society, are ready to tackle the root issues of racial inequality and injustice within law enforcement. The time to act is now, and this video has hopefully opened the door for you to think critically about the steps we must take. If you found this video insightful, if it sparked a conversation in your mind or even challenged your perspective, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue discussing important stories like this one that shape our world. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. What do you think needs to change? I'd love to hear your opinions on this issue and how we can work together to address these injustices. And if you want to stay updated on the latest stories that matter, be sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an important update. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more in-depth discussions on the issues that affect us all. Let's keep the conversation going and make our voices heard.